Welcome to the second installment of Storytelling Studies. Today we're going to be looking at how New Vegas can inspire you on how to write and represent your political ideologies in your stories. So, in particular, we're going to be looking at how we can engage people of massively varied worldviews whilst making it all still feel like it fits in one collective universe and trying to still say something impactful in the end. We're only focusing on the four major factions today, although you could easily apply this to all other factions. We're not going to dive down that huge rabbit hole today. I don't have the patience or that much time for that. No. So we're going to be diving into how the positives and negatives of each faction sort of lend them to being a realistic feeling betrayal for each ideology across the political spectrum, whilst not saying nothing, being indecisive, etc., etc. So first we're going to be going over the arguments in favor of each faction, and then we'll be looping back around and going over the arguments against each faction. So for House, one of the first arguments in favor of him is that he objectively has the most technological knowledge of the major factions. Obviously more than Caesar's Legion and a little bit more than NCR, and obviously the Courier would not possibly know how to use Yes Man and his robots better than him. Perhaps, maybe eventually equal to him, but more than him, I would hesitate to say that. In addition, he has the longest record of stability in a sense. Like, Vegas is still standing, and it's been standing for over 200 years because of him. See, neither Caesar's Legion nor the NCR nor the Courier, of course, or Yes Man / Yes Man have nearly any sort of track record that could remotely compare to that. And then pre-start of the game, as I just mentioned, it's the reason why New Vegas is even like worthwhile to anybody in the first place is because of House. He saved it and has kept it running relatively safely. So, and he's also the only faction that hasn't explicitly, as far as I'm aware, forced anybody to work for him. I mean, you could argue with how like mean and rude he is and then refuses to like work with the Courier. Maybe that could be an exception. And not to say that there aren't factions he won't deal with, but nobody who already works for him didn't sign a contract or give some sort of consent to deal with him. You know what I'm saying? And then, I mean, he's also the only faction that doesn't explicitly want to destroy other factions, if I recall correctly. I mean, Yes Man / you, it's kind of up to yourself, but like Caesar's Legion explicitly wants to destroy everybody, and the NCR, of course, explicitly wants to destroy Caesar's Legion, but also wants to absorb House's New Vegas, and same thing with Caesar's Legion. So, whereas House, as far as he's concerned, if both the two just left him alone, he would not do any sort of like invading of their territory, unlike them towards him. As far as arguments in favor of the NCR are concerned, they give men and women equal rights. That's enshrined in their laws. They're less hostile to ghouls and mutants enshrined in law, although in practice that's a little bit more iffy than ensuring women have equal rights in the NCR. Most empowerment of their citizens on average. Because with the Yes Man on one, obviously it can vary a lot, so that's why I'm saying on average there. Because I think everybody would agree on average, that is for sure. If we were to say the most definitively, then all of a sudden nobody agrees. Most public access to technology of all the factions, just because I'm making that argument because from my frame of reference and from what I see most people say, they tend to view the level of technology as House is the most, NCR is the second most, and then a Yes Man ending as the third most, with obviously Caesar's Legion at the bottom. And then so with that in mind, House isn't going to make that technology very accessible, whereas Yes Man, that ending would probably result in that, but the NCR would definitely result in that. So henceforth the most public access to the best technology, relatively speaking. And the leadership is most amenable to change as far as we're aware evidence-wise. In theory, again, with Yes Man, we don't know. But as far as evidence are concerned, we know that if you put effort in, you can change the NCR's mind on wiping out a lot of factions and make them negotiate and be morally better instead. They actively protect small towns like Prim. They're not just gonna. I mean, there are exceptions. They have done pretty bad shit, but they haven't burned entire towns like the Legion has with Nipton, and they're not going to ignore small settlements on their very doorstep like House with Freeside. And they also are going to give the citizens, they do give the citizens power to change the rules and leadership, not equally, not fairly. It's much like modern day republics in that way, where lobbyists have a significant amount of interest. But it is absolutely possible, if enough energy is put behind it, for things to change within that own system. And House nor Caesar's Legion can make that argument. And even Yes Man couldn't really, because they don't have a definitive system. That would have to be entirely voluntary by people. As far as arguments for Yes Man are concerned, for one, none of your allies are bound by law or contract, and thus they could freely dissent or override the courier. Which also means that this would be the only potential for a true democracy to emerge in the wasteland, like the political definition of a true democracy, TM, if you wanted that. It's going to resist all autocratic imperial powers, a Yes Man ending, so Caesar's Legion, NCR, and House, all of them just nope. They don't get to control the Mojave, which henceforth would most empower the citizens of the Mojave themselves. It'd be the only choice that doesn't require the destruction of any side faction. I think I might be wrong on the NCR, but I'm 99% sure that's correct. It's going to be one thing to keep in mind, too, is the courier is a citizen of the wasteland themselves, and obviously Yes Man is going to be the ending that's most respectful of the player's own consent, right? Like, the player themselves is a citizen, so they should also have a voice, too, and a vote in what happens in the Mojave. And it would also be least likely to replicate the systems of the old world for very obvious reasons, because you couldn't very directly tie the sort of nebulous chaos that the Yes Man ending is to any exact system in our world. Whereas, like, the NCR, you could tie it to a lot of liberal democracies. House's ending, you could tie it to a lot of more authoritarian capitalist states like China and Singapore. And then for Caesar's Legion, you could tie it to a lot of historical fascistic states, which name countless of those. But Yes Man really doesn't have a historical analog, so that would really be like doing something brand new. As far as the arguments against House, well, I mean, for one, he's a self-described autocrat, so that's not exactly good. And thus, he's not going to be beholden to any oversight or power checks. And then his old age, I mean, people would say, like, that's his wisdom or whatever, but I would argue because he's over, like, several hundred years old, and his technology that keeps him alive that long is so inaccessible, and ironically makes him inaccessible to other people in, like, a physical form at least. He has to have, like, computer screens and stuff like that. It just makes him disconnected to the public, and I think that's a bad situation for any person with any power, especially someone who would have all the power. I mean, he completely rejects any sort of negotiation with the Kings of the Brotherhood of Steel. The Brotherhood of Steel, I can kind of understand from his perspective, but the Kings, that's just not justifiable, sending in the robots to kill them. That's just unjustifiable. He also made tech. I mean, I don't remember exactly how much. I wish I had looked more into this, but I guess it doesn't really matter for the point. He made tech for the U.S. military beforehand, so he made technology for one of the factions that caused the rising tensions and ended the world. So he saved Vegas, but you could argue he was part of a cog in the machine that was destroying the world, meaning that Vegas needed to be saved in the first place. He also explicitly doesn't care about the well-being of Freeside and Westside, as mentioned earlier, by wiping out the Kings. I mean, arguably, he would make an even more unequal society than the corruptness and all of that of the NCR, which is almost, well, no, actually, that's impressive, but in a bad way. And also, if you were to think about it, I mean, I could hear some arguments for the Yes Men faction, but personally, I think that House, and most people would agree with me, is the least resistant faction to their leader changing or being taken out. Because without House, well, what is they're literally that's it. You know what I'm saying? You could take out the president of the NCR and they will be replaced. You could take out Caesar and they will be replaced by Lanius. Technically, you could take out either the Yes Man or the Courier, and the other could take over after the other as well, which isn't a lot, but it's more than what House has going on, that's for sure. Now, the negatives for the Legion, we've got more negatives than positives, surprisingly. I mean, everybody's gonna agree that they're sexist as all hell. They're cruel, they torture people, a lot of instability because Caesar's has a brain tumor, so if you don't do surgery on him, he will die in game. Also, just due to how he rules, that's just an unstable way to rule. Somebody would really want to kill him. And then also, if like Atlantis takes over, he's pretty much just a warmonger. So that would be pretty self-destructive. Although, another point, even under Caesar, they're still constantly under a state of war. They're constantly. I mean, the NCR is a constantly expansionist too, but they're not 24/7 treating their whole state like it's constantly at a state of war, right? Like the Brahmin Barons back in California in the NCR are probably living like normal day-to-day stuff, whereas everything in the Legion from back home, like everything is super intense and geared towards that constant statewide militarization, which is exhausting of resources and inhumane for obvious reasons. They destroy records, tech, and like instantly kill people that point out, oh, hey, you're doing the shit that the Roman Empire did. They're basically doing what the Khmer Rouge did, if you're familiar with history. And that has obvious problems, both morally and for your own people under you, because of the consequences of that. Hence, referencing the Khmer Rouge, they're blatantly genocidal. And when you put all these points together, I don't see how you couldn't argue that they're blatantly fascist. So that's kind of a big fucking negative against Caesar's Legion. As far as the arguments against the NCR, well, they're blatantly imperialist. The Mojave didn't ask for the NCR to go there, and yet they showed up and started taking shit over anyways, regardless of if the people voted them in or not. Even though there are some towns like Prim that can consensually join them, if they decide they want a town, it doesn't matter if they want to consensually join. That town is just going to be attacked by the NCR, or at the very least, hit with some sort of legal or financial like aggression to make them a part of the NCR. They're more beholden to lobby groups than their people. Even their own people and soldiers will constantly say that and mention that. They have a very slow and unequal justice system. I know if you try to solve Cass's problems through the justice system, she specifically says it's going to take years. The Van Graffs might get hell and good, but years down the line, that's a blatant sign of a pretty slow and unequal justice system. A greedy government, hence that tends to go along with that and the lobby groups. If not forced to do otherwise, the NCR is gonna kill most side factions. Like the order you get is their average disposition is wipe out everybody basically, unless you give them a good reason not to. And that's not good. You should probably view the world the opposite way, especially as such a powerful faction. And of course, they're just deep. I mean, this kind of ties to lobby groups, but not just all lobbyists, but very specifically the Brahmin Barons have a significant amount of control and get the frontline soldiers in positions where they have less equipment, less food, and are worse off, which is very counterintuitive. As far as the arguments against Yes Man are concerned, for one, the most commonly cited one, there's a huge potential for a Yes Man overthrow and a robotic totalitarian state type of thing. Although the few comments we get from developers don't seem to indicate that, and I feel like people are trying to connect strings that aren't there where they make arguments for that. Not that they don't make good arguments, but when I look at the evidence as a whole, as a totality, I don't see that, but that is still a very commonly cited negative, and even I could not disagree that it is absolutely possible, therefore it is a negative and a concern. 2, it would probably be the option that would give the Mojave the most limited resources. Asterisk on that, it depends on how the other factions would treat exploiting the Mojave itself, but if the Mojave was part of the NCR, you could at least potentially bring in all those resources from California to the Mojave. Same thing with Caesar's Legion and bringing their stuff from east into the Mojave. And even same thing with House because of all of his technology and stuff, which, again, the Courier could take over, but again, I would not argue they would be able to utilize better than House. Maybe equal at best, but definitely not better than. It's also going to make all the bordering major powers hostile to your area. If one of the other factions takes it over, at least you have a major power, one could argue, protecting that area, whereas for this one, no major power currently is protecting you, and all major powers are actively trying to invade you, which is not a good recipe for success long term. Henceforth, it's going to give by far the least stability, and it would technically leave the Mojave literally lawless, which most people would argue that's a bad thing. And of course, it would also be basically any authority either Yes Man or the Courier would have would be entirely dependent on robots, and not even just getting into like some of the human fears of like the immorality and like autocracy of a robot dictatorship or something like that. Just robots have certain fallacies that humans don't have, right? They can literally be hacked. They can have their circuits break down and things such as this. So there are certain vulnerabilities to relying on robots for your entire military that you wouldn't have if you used people instead. And that also includes them having more of a voice and more representation, hence leading to a fairer system, hence leading to leaders being more likely to be held account in a robot army. I don't know how accountable a leader would be in a robot army, you know what I'm saying? Thus, with such an elaborate yet plausible set of traits and goals to each faction, you can have a game that appeals and engages to all sorts of worldviews on how to build a better world from a video game. From Fallout channels I love, like your boy, who justifies House autocracy.
House admittedly does have many flaws. He's inflexible, arrogant, and while he's not an evil man, he's certainly capable of committing evil acts to accomplish his goals. He tunnel visions on the big picture, and his my way or the highway approach to policy does not make him popular to many of his subordinates. Despite this, I do still believe that he is the best choice for the Mojave and the people within it. Some may state that House does not have the right to rule the wasteland. However, the Mojave and all the infrastructure that makes it so appealing would not exist if not for House. Under his stewardship, cold and calculating it may be, there is a future, not just for the Mojave, but for humanity itself. And in this future, the Great War may be even seen in hindsight as just a minor blip in the next stage of human history.
To self-described capitalists like Oxhorn who make a humble argument in favor of the NCR.
The problem, as Cass said, is with NCR leadership. And thankfully, because it's a republic, that leadership can and will change. It's the only faction whose leadership can change by the will of the people, who are affected by the decisions that leadership makes. As long as there are good people in the NCR, on the ground in the Mojave and in California, then there's hope that the NCR will one day get better leadership and make better decisions that affect so many people. In short, I ultimately chose to side with the NCR because it is the faction that gets closest to achieving the things that I think are most important for a nation to achieve. The greatest amount of freedom for the most number of people, a desire to defend and means by which to defend that freedom from individuals and factions that wish to rob people of that freedom, and an established history that gives me faith that they'll be around for a long time to come.
and some brand new channels I came across researching for this video, such as Even Bad Wolves Gaming, who makes a genuine deep argument in favor of the infamously evil Legion.
The NCR forces are stretched thin as it is, and they are struggling to maintain order in their own territory. Ultimately, the NCR's reliance on dwindling old world resources they don't have the knowledge to sustain, along with the corruption in their society and their dual need to expand, and lack of capacity to do so, mean the NCR is not sustainable in its current form. The Legion, on the other hand, as brutal as its frontline forces are, they have a chance.
And lastly, Roman history buff Dan Costa Academicus, who ironically enough doesn't argue for Caesar, but actually for Yes Man, which it's a pretty solid case despite the fact that the reasons he uses for justifying Yes Man ending are literally none of the ones that I would use. But that's part of the reason why I think this game is so great, because we can make literally entirely different arguments for the same faction.
The best part about Yes Man is that you get what you get, a free and independent New Vegas. If you look closely to the ending slides with Yes Man, towns thrive, Vegas is secured, Freeside becomes a haven, the Mojave is given the chance to create its own world, its own nation, its own freedom. There is one thing I would like to argue against, and that is General Lee Oliver's statement at the end of the game, which some people use as an arguing point against siding with Yes Man. Here's the clip.
Do you know what you're doing? Making a nation like you think you're doing ain't like chowing down on a pile of fancy lad snack cakes. Think you got the guts to carve out a frontier? Build towns, protect the roads, run supplies, train troops?
First things first is people assume it's the courier's job to do all this, when in reality he doesn't have to do anything. The people of the Mojave will see to that. Carving out a frontier doesn't have to happen. The Mojave doesn't have to be some superpower that expands its borders or else. Actually, the landscape around the borders of the Mojave makes defense of the Mojave easy. There are a lot of natural choke points that can be defended easily by a militia or Securitron army.
Ultimately, New Vegas is a showcase on how to do politics in your world building, and all developers of all games, be that video games or tabletop, should take notes. It's one of the key reasons why 14 years later now, this game is still talked about so much. That's the end of this one. Remember to love and be kind to yourselves out there. Peace.